Part 2. Directions. In this part, you will hear 3 conversations. The conversations will not be repeated. There are 4 questions for each conversation. For each question, choose the right answer, A, B, C, or D. Then on the answer sheet, find the number of the question and fill in the space that corresponds to the letter of the answer you have chosen. Questions 9 to 12.
Listen to part of a conversation between a librarian and a student.
First, you have some time to look at questions 9 to 12.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Are you the reference librarian?
Yes. How can I help you?
Well, I'm looking for a book that compares Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and the United States.
Okay. What exactly are you trying to compare?
I'm not quite sure. How about the cost of living?
Oh. Well, cost of living is, well, it's not very specific. I mean, what aspects of the cost of living do you need to find? Cost of living is a fairly broad topic.
It is?
Well, yes. Do you want this for personal information or is it for a class?
It's for my economics class.
Uh-huh.
With Professor Brooks.
Oh, okay. Well, do you just need numbers or is it a report, a narrative?
Just the numbers. I'm supposed to make a chart. It can be either a pie chart or a bar graph, and I have to have some demographic information, in order to do the chart.
So you want a general comparison. I'm trying to imagine what you'll put on the graph.
Well, I'm not too clear about that. I was thinking I might make several graphs, one for each country with the cost of basic things on it, and then I could compare the graphs.
Was that the assignment? Maybe if you could explain the assignment to me.
Okay. I have it right here, somewhere. Just a minute. Okay, here it is. It says, make a pie chart or a bar graph with at least 4 parts. It should be large enough to share with the class.
That's it?
Uh-huh. But it's for an economics class, and we have to be able to explain it to everyone. So that's why I was going for the cost of living, and my major's international business, so I was interested in comparing several countries.
But the professor really only asked you for one chart.
I guess so. But I'm trying to figure out how to compare those countries on one chart, and it's not that easy.
Okay. Well,
You think I should just do the one chart then?
it's usually better to follow the instructions for an assignment, unless...
Oh, even if it's more than the professor asked for?
It's usually better to check with the professor first, if you want to change the assignment.
Okay, then. I guess I need to choose one country and compare several factors for the one country.
Or, if you want to compare several countries, you probably need to zero in on one factor.
Yeah.
Like the average income for a family of 4, or...
Oh, I see. Maybe I could compare the cost of a home.
Right.
So I could find that in an encyclopedia then.
Well, maybe. But you want current data, and I'm not sure that you'd find demographics on income and home prices in an encyclopedia. Anyway, look, why don't I show you where you can find some reference materials in economics? Then you can browse for a while. Maybe you'll find something that sparks an idea. But if you don't, then just come back to my desk and I'll look with you.
Thanks. That's great.
Why does the man approach the librarian? What does the librarian imply? What example does the librarian give for the assignment? What will the man do with the information?
questions 13 to 16.
Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
First, you have some time to look at questions 13 to 16.
Hi, Dr. Davis. I'm a little early. Should I wait outside?
No, come on in. I'm free. What did you want to talk about?
Well, I've read the first couple of books you had on my list, the reading list for my independent study, and I was just wondering how you want me to report them to you. We didn't really talk about that.
Well, I'm glad you stopped by. Let me think. Didn't you have a project to do in addition to the reading list?
Yes, you said it could be a research paper, or I could come up with a proposal for a different kind of project.
That's right. So the reading list is background information then. Why don't you just come in when you finish the first part of the list? I think it was divided in 2 distinct parts. So just come in and we'll talk about the readings.
You mean I should prepare a synopsis of each book and kind of report to you on each one?
No, nothing as formal as that. I was thinking more along the lines of a conversation. As I recall, the list has a focus, doesn't it?
Definitely. All of the books are novels and plays from the second half of the 20th century.
The postmodern period, then. And all North American novelists and playwrights.
Right.
So we should be able to find some common threads, then. Remember, though, postmodernism is very difficult to define precisely. Maybe we could start with a discussion of the themes that emerge in the collection of literature from that period.
That sounds interesting.
I think so, too. And by the time you get through with the second half of the reading list and we get together again, maybe we can figure out whether we're looking at a logical extension of postmodernism or whether there's actually a new movement there in the readings on the second part. If you'll notice, there are quite a few minority writers represented, so you might want to think about what that means.
I noticed that in the list. The first part of the list has the usual North American writers and, of course, a good representation of women writers, as you'd expect. But the second part of the list includes a number of African American authors, several Hispanic American writers, and a few Oriental Americans.
It's a multi-ethnic mix.
Yeah.
Good. So, have you decided whether you want to do a paper or something else, perhaps?
To tell the truth, I'd really like to do something a little more creative. Maybe bring in some visuals on the computer as part of the, I don't know, I suppose you'd call it a mixed media report. But I've never done anything like that before.
But that's what an independent study is designed to do. It's an opportunity to experiment and to have some one-on-one time with a professor.
But a research paper is easier in some ways. At least I know that I can do a decent job. The computer project's unknown territory.
True, but remember it's unknown territory for all of us. I think I've heard some references to cybermodernism. If you want to investigate some of the work that's being created in, as you call it, mixed media literature.
Cybermodernism? Wow.
I think you'd find it interesting. Anyway, it's up to you. It's your project.
Thanks. I'm really excited about doing this independent study. Actually, I'm spending more time on it than on any of my other classes.
I've found that students usually invest more time and energy in a class that they can design. That's why I like to direct them. Oh, and Terry, if you run into any problems, don't wait until you're halfway through your reading list. Just stop by during my office hours. Maybe I can give you some references or at least a sounding board.
Thanks. This is better than I even expected.
Why does the man go to see his professor? How is the second part of the reading list different from the first part? What will the man probably do before the next meeting? 5. What can be inferred about the professor?
Questions 17 to 20.
Now listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
First, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20.
Excuse me, Professor Jones. I was wondering whether I could talk with you for a minute. If you're busy now, though.
Sure, Anne. What's up?
Well, I've been working on my research project. I'm doing it on decaffeinated beverages.
Oh, I remember. That's going to be interesting. How's it going?
Good. I've got all the data, but the report's turning out to be fairly short. It took such a long time to do the research, I thought I'd have a lot more to write about.
Well, how long will it be, do you think?
Probably 5 or 6 pages, and that includes a couple of pages with charts in them.
That sounds about right.
It does?
Yes. Oh, of course, it depends on what you included in the 5 pages. The issue here is whether the research design was well thought out and whether you have all the information in your report that you need to explain what you did, the approach, and the results that you found.
Okay. I have a short introduction, just a few paragraphs, really. So that's about caffeine. And then I talk about the benefits of decaffeination and several ways to do that.
Uh-huh. What else?
Well, I explain my research design, and that's sort of a problem, too, because I'm not sure whether to make this sound like a book, you know, the way the studies are explained in our textbook, or whether I should just write it up as clearly as I can so that anyone would understand what I did.
I'd go for that option. In fact, why don't you ask a few friends to read it before you turn it in? If your friends get it, that's a good indication that you've explained it well. But if they have a lot of questions, then maybe you need to do some rewriting. And Anne, it's even better if your friends aren't chemistry majors like you are.
Well, I would never have thought of that.
Then I'm glad I suggested it. By the way, did you include references at the end of your study?
Just 2. That's all I used.
Okay, good. Just as long as you cite the references you used.
Well, thanks. This is the first time I've ever done my own research. It was hard because I didn't have any experience, but it was fun, too. I was thinking about trying to get a part-time job as a lab assistant next year.
I think you'd be a good candidate. In fact, why don't you write up a draft of that report and I'll look it over for you before you hand in the final copy.
That would be perfect. I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Okay, then, why don't you bring it to class on Friday?
It'd be great.
And if you're really serious about that lab assistant position, I can give you some information about that when I see you.
Oh, I can't thank you enough.
Not at all, Anne. You've got a lot going for you. I'm glad to help.
Why does the woman want to talk with her professor? What advice does the professor give the woman? What does the professor offer to do? Listen again to part of the conversation, and then answer the following question.
I could bring it in on Monday, since that's when you have your usual office hours. Would that be okay?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
Oh, right.
Why does the professor say this?
Yes, but that'd only give you 1 day before the report's due.
That is the end of Part 2. Part 3. Directions. In this part, you will hear 3 talks or lectures. The talks or lectures will not be repeated. There are 5 questions for each talk or lecture. For each question, choose the right answer, A, B, C, or D. Then, on the answer sheet, find the number of the question and fill in the space that corresponds to the letter of the answer you have chosen. Questions 21 to 25.
Listen to part of a discussion in a literature class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25.
Today, we're continuing our discussion of Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. We left off last session at the point where Gulliver began his 4th voyage as the captain of a merchant ship. As you'll recall, his crew had confined him and cast him ashore on an island. While making his way along a road, he was attacked by a herd of deformed beasts with brown skin and no tails. But suddenly, the attack was interrupted by the appearance of a beautiful horse. And this is where we left off. So what happens next?
Well, another horse comes along, and they appear to be having a conversation. The 2 horses, I mean. And they keep using the words Yahoo and Houyhnhnm. So Gulliver is able to understand that Yahoo refers to the animals that attacked him, and Houyhnhnm refers to the horses. Then Gulliver goes home with the horses.
And what is Gulliver thinking about while he's observing the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms?
Oh, this was good. He starts to understand that the only difference between himself and the Yahoos is his clothing. But he's horrified by this. So we see him trying to be more like the horses.
How do you know that he's striving to emulate the Houyhnhnms?
Well, he learns their language so he can communicate with them.
Right. So this brings us to the most important part of the narrative, the comparison between the Yahoos and the Houyhnhnms. First, tell us how the Yahoos are portrayed. What do they eat? How do they look?
Well, I think the author used the word depraved several times. They eat dog and donkey meat and even garbage, and they drink too much. And he says they're filthy and they stink.
So their behavior, the Yahoos' behavior, is neither rational nor moral. Now, take a look at the description of the Yahoos that Gulliver has known in England. Let me refer to the book here. Okay, Gulliver explains that Yahoos in England fight wars for religious reasons, that lawyers use reason to argue for the wrong side, that the wealthy live to acquire more luxuries, and that greed makes them ill. By this we assume that he's referring to the rich gourmet diet that causes gout and other health problems among the upper classes. So this is in contrast with the Houyhnhnms, right? How so?
Yes.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that they eat oats, bread, and honey, but not meat, not other animals, and they don't drink.
I think it's important that they don't even understand the concept of a lie. That proves that they have a very innocent nature.
Good point. You're referring to the fact that they failed to grasp how the crew was able to initiate the mutiny that brought Gulliver to their island.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what do the Houyhnhnms think about Gulliver? And what does Gulliver conclude about himself?
Well, Gulliver isn't really a Yahoo, and he isn't really a Houyhnhnm either. I'd say he's kind of in the middle, but he's trying to become a Houyhnhnm. When he goes back to England, he's actually afraid of other humans. I mean, Yahoos.
But he can't quite achieve his transformation, can he? even though his pride motivates him to continue the impossible pursuit of perfection. So, what does this all mean?
I think it's like the other chapters. The fourth voyage it's another critique of the weaknesses in human nature.
Then Swift's making the point that although humankind is capable of rational behavior, we seldom choose to exercise it. The very meaning of the word Yahoo in the Houyhnhnm language is evil. So Swift's very satirical then. And when we consider the time period for the book, the early 1700s, we must appreciate the exceptional departure from the literature of the era, which was mostly written to flatter or entertain. Swift used satire to provide the reader with a perspective that's very different from that of other writers in an age of science and reason.
What is the discussion mainly about? What does Gulliver learn about himself? Listen again to part of the discussion, and then answer the following question.
But he can't quite achieve his transformation, can he? Even though his pride motivates him to continue the impossible pursuit of perfection. So, what does this all mean?
Why does the professor say this?
So, what does this all mean?
According to the professor, what kind of book is Gulliver's Travels? What can we infer about the literature of the period?
Questions 26 to 30.
Listen to part of a discussion in a geology class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30.
The exploitation of minerals involves 5 steps. First, you have to explore and locate the mineral deposits. Then you set up a mining operation. Next, you must refine the raw minerals and transport the refined minerals to the manufacturer.
Excuse me, sorry, I only have 4 steps. Could you...
Oh, sure. That's exploration, mining, refining, transportation, and manufacturing.
Thanks.
So, each of these activities involves costs. There are costs associated with them, and the costs can be economic, but not necessarily so. Mineral exploitation also has environmental costs associated with it. For example, the exploration stage will clearly have a high economic cost because of personnel and technology, but the environmental cost will probably be quite low. Now, why would that be, do you think?
Because you aren't actually disturbing the environment, you're just looking. I mean, after you find a mineral deposit, you don't do anything about it at that stage.
Right, so the environmental cost would be low. But what happens when you use up all the resources that are easy to find? Then what?
Then the costs go up for exploration.
Which costs?
Well, probably both of them. But I can see where the economic cost would increase.
Okay. Let's say, for example, that some areas such as national parks or historic reserves have been off limits to exploration. What'll happen when we use up the minerals outside of these areas? Remember now that these are non-renewable resources that we're looking for.
Then there'll be a lot of pressure? You know, to open up these areas to exploration and exploitation.
Probably so. And that means that there could be a high environmental cost. Any other options?
Find an alternative.
Yes, you're on the right track.
Okay, find an alternative. A substitute, something that'll substitute for the mineral. Maybe something man-made?
Good. That'll involve a different kind of exploration, again with economic costs. I'm talking about basic research here to find synthetics. But let's go on to the other steps and we'll see if we can pull this all together. How about mining? Now, we're looking at high environmental costs because of the destruction of the landscape and the accumulation of waste products that have to be dealt with. Air and water pollution is almost always a problem. Any ideas on refining?
Wouldn't it be the same as mining? You'd have high costs because of labor and equipment, and there'd be problems of waste and pollution, like you said.
True. And in refining, well, that often involves the separation of a small amount of a valuable mineral from a large amount of surrounding rock. So that means that refining also carries the additional cost of cleanup. And don't forget that it's often difficult to get vegetation to grow on piles of waste. In fact, some of it, the waste piles, they can even be dangerous to living creatures, including people, not to mention the appearance of the area. So the environmental costs can be extremely high. Isn't it sad and ironic that so much of the mining and refining must take place in areas of great natural beauty?
So you're saying that both mining and refining have heavy costs, heavy economic and environmental costs.
Right. And in both mining and refining, you'd need transportation to support the movement of supplies, equipment, and personnel. But after the minerals are mined and refined, then transportation becomes even more essential.
And I was just thinking that in addition to the economic costs of the transportation for trucks and fuel and labor and everything, there might be some construction too, if there aren't any roads in or out of the area.
And that would mean?
That would mean that the landscape and even the ecosystem for the plants and animal life could be altered. So that's an environmental cost.
It is indeed. Good point. That leaves us with manufacturing. After we find it, mine it, refine it, and transport it, we still have to manufacture it. What are the costs associated with that? Well, construction again for factories. Then there'd be energy costs, technology, and labor.
So all that's economic. No environmental costs in manufacturing, then?
Well, yes, there are, actually. Pollution's often a costly problem for manufacturing plants.
Oh, right. I was thinking of the natural landscape, and the manufacturing is often positioned near cities to take advantage of the labor pool. But cities have the environmental problems associated with pollution. So every step has both economic and environmental costs, then?
Right.
What is this discussion mainly about? Listen again to part of the discussion and then answer the following question.
And I was just thinking that in addition to the economic costs of the transportation for trucks and fuel and labor and everything, there might be some construction too, if there aren't any roads in or out of the area.
And that would mean?
Why does the professor say this?
And that would mean?
What option is proposed as an alternative when all of the mineral resources in easily accessible locations have been depleted? What does the professor imply about the environmental costs of mineral exploitation? (17) What does the professor want the students to do in this class session?
Questions 31 to 35.
Listen to part of a discussion in an art history class. The professor is talking about action art.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 35.
In the 1950s, abstract expressionism emerged among a group of painters that came to be known as the New York School, although the members included artists from many regions of the United States and several European countries as well. In any case, we know that the brushstrokes were a significant feature of the work of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist painters, and like them, the abstract expressionists were interested in the expressive qualities of paint, and particularly in the case of action painters or gesture painters. They were sometimes called gesture painters, and they developed new methods for applying the paint. They dripped, threw, sprayed, and splattered paint on the canvas with a view to expressing artistic actions or gestures as part of the creative process. Now, according to your textbook, probably the best known of the action painters was who?
Pollock?
Jackson Pollock.
No doubt about it. Pollock was a highly individual artist. He's famous for huge mural-sized works, and to create them, he'd spread his unstretched canvas on the floor, and he'd approach the work from all four sides, walking around it and attacking it with commercial house paint in cans that he carried with him. He dripped the paint from sticks or brushes that he dipped in the cans, or he threw the paint and splashed it in patterns that reflected the motion of his arm and his body as he engaged in his so-called action painting. I think you can see how the name applies to this method. So Pollock claimed that this process allowed him to be in the painting, not apart from it. Let me show you a picture of Pollock with a work in progress. As you can see, and this is Pollock, he's stepping right onto the canvas, splattering and dripping the paint. He's focusing on the act of painting, and he's using grand rhythmic gestures, sort of similar to a dance. In fact, some critics referred to the work as a performance or a choreographed activity. He also used to pour the paint directly out of the can, and occasionally threw sand, broken glass, pebbles and string and other objects. He'd throw them onto the canvas. So, how much of the action art was a result of decisions, and how much was pure chance? What do you think?
Well, there was probably a little bit of both going on there.
Probably so. But Pollock contended that he could control the flow of the paint with the motion of his arm and body, and that his work was not accidental. And it certainly was spontaneous in the sense that it happened very quickly, and the decisions that he made were of necessity, split-second choices. So I'd say you're right that action art, and Pollock's work in particular, is a combination of chance, of artistic intuition, and control. And I should point out that he was known to retouch a drip with a brush on occasion. Now let me show you an example of the paintings themselves. What do you see?
There's no visual center of attention.
Which means?
Which means the image has no foreground, no background, no focus of attention.
I see. However, I think you'll agree that it does have a complex unity, a balance of form and color. Look at the patterns. Wouldn't you agree that they're caused by the separation and weaving of one pigment in another? And it was this weaving that produced a number of tones from a minimal palette of paints. Have any of you ever seen an original Pollock?
I have. I went to the Guggenheim Museum when I was in New York last year.
Could you tell the class a little about it?
Sure. I thought that the work looked like skeins of yarn, because the dripping and the small objects produced
Texture?
yeah, texture as well as form, like yarn. And I also remember the light that seemed to be in the canvas.
And precisely because of the texture and light, it's really a disservice to see this as a flat slide.
Oh, another thing. A lot of the paintings were identified by numbers instead of names.
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. Some people think he did that because he didn't want to limit the imagination. He wanted others to view a painting without prejudice, so to speak. But one piece has come to be called Lavender Mist. I'm not really sure whether Pollock actually named it or not, but it's particularly interesting because the artist marked the image with his handprints. I think it's in your textbook, but again, seeing it with the texture of the paint is a different experience. Okay, so after the process of creation, we see beauty, order, unity, perhaps even rhythm in an incredible light emanating from the canvas. Pollock wanted to express his feelings rather than to merely illustrate them, and I think he did achieve that. And whether you like them or not, and many critics argued and continue to argue their merits, but it's undeniable that works by Pollock are unique and recognizable, and virtually impossible to copy. It's also clear that he had a remarkable influence on later artists, color field painters who adapted the paint-pouring methods, and modern artists who chose to work with all-over patterns, and the performance artists who continue to push the envelope on activity and process.
What is this discussion mainly about? To what did some critics compare Pollock's work? According to the professor, what defines action art? What is interesting about the painting Lavender Mist? What is the professor's opinion of Pollock?
That is the end of Part 3. Now, you will have 7 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet.